Good morning, Zoom folks and in-person folks. Sorry that I'm a minute late. I got caught up on my computer in my office, so.
So like next year would be my last year.
Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen for our Zoom folks, and we can dive right back on in to our lecture here. Shove this up there. And slideshow. Alrighty, I started grading your exams. I've got like 3 people's done. I will get there this weekend. Thank you so much for your patience. I normally do not take this long. So again, I very much appreciate your understanding. Alrighty, so keep on keeping on here, talking about the learning theory of personality. And in particular, we're going to talk about, what does learning theory say about where personality is, or how personality interacts, how personality is created. And we're going to start by talking about uniqueness. So this is an idea that comes out of observational learning. So if you remember from Wednesday, observational learning is the Bobo doll study. It's when you watch somebody else and then you do or don't do something based on how it goes for them, right? So if in the Bobo doll study, the adults had been punished for beating up the Bobo doll, the kids probably wouldn't have replicated the behaviors. And this is indicative of cognitive social learning theory in general, the idea of uniqueness. So some of the theories we've talked about kind of talk about universalities, and others talk about uniqueness. And this is one that really focuses on how each person is unique. Each of us is unique in regard to our circumstances. So if we think about the existential idea of thrownness, right? What you're born into, you can't control, right? Comes into play here as well. Personal factors or person variables. So we're going to talk a lot about these for the rest of this lecture. Attitudes, self-control strategies, something that's called schema, which are like our shortcuts for the way we think about things, including ourselves. And then behavioral abnormalities that we might have. And these will all influence the development of personality and also how we react to things around us. And our own personality, our own behaviors can influence the environment around us. And a big part of this, and it's a big crux of cognitive social learning theory in general, is reciprocal determinism. This is the idea that everything is a reciprocal set of relationships, which is best illustrated by this lovely diagram. So here we have environmental, contextual, behavioral, and personal factors. Environmental contextual here is the situation that we're in, classroom, at work, out on the path, walking from one building to another, right? But it's also the consequences of that situation. I mean, that voicemail. Or of our own behavior, right? So let's say everybody has a big, exciting Halloween party this weekend, and you go out in the morning and the lawn is just covered in bottles and trash and things like that. You can choose to engage in a behavior where you pick up a few cans and someone else picks up a few cans, and next thing you know, it looks great, right? So our own behavior can influence our circumstances. The personal is the person, it's our cognitions, our thoughts, and behavioral is what we do. So environmental contextual includes things like the things that stress us out, but also the things that are supports, right? So yeah, school might stress us out, work might stress me out, but we have friends or family members, right, that we can lean on or maybe study with, things along those lines. And also reinforcements and punishments, right? And like these might obviously not be as obvious as like the dogs who got food and Pavlov's experiments, right? Or the pigeons in the Skinner boxes. But for us, it might be if I choose to go out to a party, and even though I haven't studied the night before a test and then I failed the test, that's a punishment, right? But if I can squeeze in my studying and then go party and I still do well, that's a reward. And personal, so it's our knowledge that we bring to every situation. It's the beliefs we have, right? So in the Halloween party, dirty lawn scenario, if you're not someone who cares about the environment or how things look, you might just walk right past it, right? Or if you're someone who's like, that's not my job, you might just walk right past it. Our attitudes, our intentions, and then the behavioral, we bring our skills to it, but then we also might have behavioral issues. So all of these conditions and relationships are reciprocally determined. So you'll see there's double-sided arrows between each of them. They can each influence each other. So the environment can influence our behavior. Our behavior and the consequences for it are going to influence our own beliefs and cognitions. We can in turn influence our environment. And the environment is, the behavior is going to influence the environment. Our thoughts can influence how we see our environment. Our beliefs can influence how we behave in a given scenario. And so it all reconnects in this way. And so if you remember our ABC model with a P thrown in here or there, and we've got a couple things happening here. So, as I said, the environment is our antecedent condition, but it's also our consequences, right? So it can be both what causes us to do something, but then also our reward or punishment for doing that thing. B is our behaviors, P is those personal factors. And in this case, we're talking about our thoughts, our cognitions, our beliefs. Okay, I just threw up a fancy little diagram, right? What does that actually have to do with modeling and observational learning? So what we can do is we can take this APBC model and we can apply it to observational learning. So we have person one. This is the person who is being observed. They have an antecedent and activating event, activating situation. So maybe person one sees the trash on the yard. Their person, their model, their beliefs, cognitions are, this looks horrible. I don't like this. I should do something about this. B is their behavior, can also be their speech, what they say. So their behavior, they start cleaning up. They might even like yell to other people like, hey, help out here, right? And C is the consequences, that they might actually feel awesome after that, and the environment's going to look better. And so the activating situation or antecedent for person two is what person one is doing. So person one becomes the A for person two. So person two is walking down the path. They see person one cleaning up and they're like, that seems like a good thing to do. Maybe I should help out. So they go and they help. And then the consequence is they also feel good and the lawn gets that much cleaner. I don't know if you all have ever heard this story about someone walking down the beach and there was a bunch of starfish that washed up. Sea stars, sorry, they're not actually fish. And they go and they pick them up. They're still alive and they pick them up and they start putting them back in the ocean. And someone else walking the other way is like, you're never going to make a difference. You're never going to save them all. And the person picks one up first and says, made a difference to that one. Right? So these small things can have consequences that we don't even realize. And one other thing that I'll say is that what you learn by observational learning can be applied right there in the moment. Or it can be sort of you remember it, you learn it, you apply it later, right? Silly example, you learn a TikTok dance, right? And maybe you're not the type of person who wants to re-upload a video of you doing it on TikTok. But then you go to a party and someone else is doing the TikTok dance and you can join in, right? So you're using it in a later setting. Riley is saying online, on 4th of July, my friend and I saw a bunch of trash on the beach. And we got trash bags, started picking up, and others saw and helped clean up. But others walked away. Yeah, and then like those your beliefs are gonna influence whether or not you join in. Or sorry, your P, your personality, your personal things. Bless you. Can influence your behavior. Yeah, that's such a good example, Riley. Bless you. Sorry, it just made me think of there's a beautiful Garth Brooks song. That the opening lyrics are, one hand reaches out and pulls a lost soul from harm, while 1,000 more go unspoken for. And they say, what good have you done by saving just this one? But it's, you make a difference in your small ways. And so this now becomes vicarious learning, as it's another word for observational learning, where we're learning vicariously through the other person. And sometimes what helps us learn is seeing the consequences of that behavior for that person. So what do you learn from this observational learning, from watching other people? Sometimes it's motivational. Why is this person doing this? And is that something I should consider? Should I do it for the same reason? Sometimes it's informational. How is this person doing? Again, how do I do this TikTok dance, right? Sometimes it's emotional. So maybe you see the person one in our diagram we were just looking at is doing something and they have bad things happen. So you can be observationally afraid. Or maybe the opposite, someone does something and they seem to enjoy it a lot. So you try it and they don't get consequences. And for example, sometimes this is why people try drugs who said they were never going to, right? Or they might drink more than they usually would because like this person's doing it, they're not getting any consequences, that looks fun. Or you've maybe never run into a snake in the wild, but you watch the movie Snakes on the Plane and now you're afraid of snakes, right? Or I think a better example is probably the movie It, right? So many people of my generation, it's probably happening again since they did the remake, were afraid of clowns because of the movie It, even though in real life, clowns are usually pretty happy, shiny people, although the makeup is a little creepy, I'll give you that, right? So those things you can learn vicariously through other people. Also evaluative. So watching them and seeing the consequences of their behavior can change your idea of a person. So you can see the model and associate either positive or negative things with them. If you're associating positive consequences with things, this can be used, manipulated. This is why a lot of advertisements use famous, attractive people, right? Oh, well, if this person who's doing really great for themselves uses this product, maybe it'll help me if I use it, right? And we know if we take a step back, that doesn't sound logical, right? Like they're doing really well because they have a lot of money, right? And probably most of us in this room are not rolling in billions of dollars. But there's something in our brain that says, they have good consequences. Maybe I should try it. I can have that too if I try it. And then influenceability. You try to be like someone else. If someone else can do it, so can I. I mean, and this has even more of a meaning in this day and age, right? Because now we have people we literally call influencers on social media, right? And people try to emulate them in various ways. And some of them are fine, right? Some of them are just picking up skills or mannerisms. And some of them are potentially have negative consequences, right? So like if you really like a certain influencer and you get cosmetic surgery to look like them, you have a horrible side effect, right? Like this can trickle in weird ways sometimes. So again, one of the things that is most important within this model is that P, those person variables or personality variables. And Michelle, who we just did a reading for trait theory, talked about the personality coefficient. So he says that there's this thing called the personality coefficient, but it's small. It's like a 0.4 correlation. And then he uses the thing that Funder doesn't like. And he's like, well, if we square that, then 16% of the variance in what a person does is explained by their personality, and 84% is not. And again, Funder's like, I don't even know if that makes sense. So fair. Remember, Michelle claims that there are no personality traits. So then what are they? Instead, there are expectancies. And what the heck does that mean? Well, imagine seeking someone out. And you're going to ask them for something. If you say to yourself, I know they're probably going to say no. That's an expectation. And if you go in with that attitude, sometimes that will influence that person's decision, whether to say yes or no, right? So the idea here is it's how the qualities of the person can impact various situations. So self-efficacy is going to come back into this. So again, if we think radical behaviorists like Skinner, they would say behavior is just a function of consequences, right? Operant conditioning, it's just whether you get rewarded or whether you get punished. Bandura would say behavior is a function of expectancies of consequences. So we're going to do a behavior or not based on what we expect to happen after we do the behavior. If we expect, based on watching other people, things are going to go horribly wrong, we don't get involved, right? If we expect making it based on other people, that looks awesome and nothing bad's happening, we're probably going to do it. And Michelle would probably be okay with Bandura's idea and agree with him. So there are these person variables that differ between individuals, but can also differ within someone's own life, depending on the situation you're in. And again, here's where Michelle's ideas come back in of like the situation is so important, right? So then we look at things like competencies. These are competencies behaviorally, things you think you can do, but also cognitively, like things you think you can think. It's very metacognitive. It gets a little like circular sometimes, but essentially competencies are, I can do this. The belief in yourself that I can do this. And so you have rules, both that you have to follow based on the contingencies in the environment, but also that you set for yourself, right? So like some people will say, well, I'm not going to use this drug because it's illegal, right? And some people will take something that is legal, like alcohol, and be like, I'm not going to drink because there's a huge history of alcoholism in my family and I don't want to go down that road, right? Things along those lines. So it's both. And then skills, what you are able to do. And then problem solving strategies, how you can use your mental abilities, those key variables, your cognitions, in a given situation to help you problem solve. So a bit more about expectancies. So we can have behavior outcome expectancies. If I do a behavior, I expect a certain outcome. This stems from operant conditioning, right? You do a behavior, you either get rewarded or punished. Example here, I believe that if I work hard and I'm really persistent, I probably have some ability coming in I'll get a really good grade in Dr. X's class. Self-behavior or self-stimulus efficacy are expectations you have about yourself and your ability to react to a stimulus. So behavior outcome is, if I do a behavior, this is what will happen to me from the outside world. Self-behavior is, I can do this behavior. I can react to this situation. So I am capable of hard work and persistence, and I have some ability academically. And then stimulus outcome or stimulus comes from classical conditioning, where we just learn what stimuli mean to us. And are they good or are they bad? So maybe we know that Dr. X rewards students fairly. So students who have all these things do well, tend to get an A in their class. Maybe there's another professor, Dr. Y, and their expectations are unreasonable, right? So even if you do all the things you've normally done, you could still end up with like a C in their class. And maybe to them that's good, but to you it's not, right? And so those also are part of this as well. And so we learn what stimuli are okay, which are not. And this is why some people will end up taking professors they prefer over and over, right? So here's an extreme example of expectancies, learned helplessness, which you may have learned about in your intro classes or other courses you have taken. So this concept was first developed by Martin Seligman, who, like, ironically now is much more of a positive psychologist than anything else. So this is sort of a weird context for that. So now we're really starting to get into the cognitive part of the cognitive social learning theory. So we're really thinking about beliefs and thoughts. And so this is related to a lack of perceived control over events. So learned helplessness is really, I have learned that nothing I will do can change this scenario. I can't control the scenario, so I'm just going to roll with it. And so he did this with a series of studies of dogs. Apologies in advance. Those of you who've had me before know I cannot draw. So my dog is going to look like a sausage, but you know what? You'll understand what I'm saying. All right, so he had this apparatus he put the dogs in. Here's the dog. It's a horrible dog, but we can all get that it's a dog. It's a happy dog. Okay. So he put the dogs in these cages, and then he would apply a light shock, not enough to hurt them, but enough to be annoying under their feet. And for some of the dogs, there would be a little barrier halfway down the cage, but they learned if they hopped over that, then there was no shock on the other side, so they could avoid the shock. Well, with the other dogs, that barrier went all the way to the top of the cage. And so when they were shocked, they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't escape it. Oftentimes they would just sort of curl up in a ball until it was over. Yes, miserable talking about it, right? Like the idea of dogs being even like uncomfortable makes me sort of upset. And to the point that after doing this and taking away the wall, making it so there was no, I guess they still probably had, because there were two sides, like a small wall, they could hop over. These dogs that had the learned helplessness didn't try to escape, even when they could. So those who were initially not allowed to get away or learned there was no way to escape, didn't even try to do so when the escape was possible. And this is learned helplessness. And Seligman really talked about this in the context of what he called a depressive attributional style. And so he said people who are depressed, particularly when they're very depressed in a major depressive episode, get this same feeling, feel like they're stuck, right? To the point that when things are a little better and they could sort of pull themselves out, sometimes they don't even realize that, right? Or take the option if it's available. So this depressive attributional style is that they make internal attributions. Everything that's happening is my fault. Negative outcomes are my own fault. It's stable. Anything bad that happens in the future will also be my fault. Negative future outcomes will also be my fault. And then global. Believing that these negative events are going to disrupt essentially all parts of your life. Many different life activities. And by having internal, stable, and global attributions, that contributes more to a sense of learned helplessness. So we talk about this, as you can see, in mood disorders like depression, but you can also talk about it in the context of things like PTSD, anxiety, things along those lines. So this just gives you an idea. So the internal, stable, global idea here would be, I have a problem with test anxiety. I can't do anything about that. I'm always going to do poorly on anxiety. But you can see if just one of those things changes, if you fail a test, you might think about it totally differently. I'm just struggling in psychology, if it's specific instead of global. If it's unstable, I had an argument with my roommate this morning. That was awful, that threw me off, right? For me, the best example of this is I did horribly on my GRE, and it's because I had a cold, stopped at like a CVS, grabbed some cold medicine, took it right before I came in, and then like the rest of the day I felt just jittery, and I was trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Turned the bottle over, it was expired for like several months. So I blame my GRE results on that. There's probably some internal stable stuff too, but it was on that. Right? It could be unstable and specific. It was this particular exam that upset me. It could be external. Written tests are never fair. Everyone knows this professor enjoys giving unfair tests. Or it could be unstable. Oh, they gave the test the day after we got back from break. No one's going to do well on it. Or externals, unstable, and specific. This particular professor didn't give much thought to the test because we know that she had this book deadline, right? So you can see all of those, you feel like there's probably something you can do, or at least you can blame it on someone else. But if it's here and you think test anxiety isn't something you can change, which it is, but let's say you believe that, then you're going to feel stuck. I'm always going to do poorly on tests because I have this problem with me that isn't going to change. Now, one thing I'll say really quickly is some people talk about learned helplessness as a way to explain why people in abusive relationships stay. Some people don't like doing that because they feel like it takes agency away from those people, but I think that we can draw some of that from there, right? When you are in an abusive relationship, you just sort of realize you start to feel like nothing is safe. And so even if there is sort of an escape route for you, you feel like it's not, it's a trap, things like that. All right, other things, thinking about things cognitively here, is thinking about encoding strategies. So people differ in the ways that they pay attention to or attend to, but also the way they organize incoming information. So everyone ends up with their own unique schemata or schemas. So you'll hear them called both plurally. Schema is always the singular, but some people will say schemata, some people will say schemas. I usually use schemas. These are basically cognitive structures that we create in our mind, and all humans do this. And the idea is they're mental shortcuts. They're ways for us to process information faster. They're organized clusters of attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. And that mediates between the information we take in from our senses and the way we respond to them. These are relatively stable and enduring ways that we perceive and know about the world. And some of these are pretty simple. So the example we often use when we're trying to explain what schema are to clients is, so when little kids are first learning about animals, anything that has 4 legs and is furry is a dog, right? Giraffe, tall doggy, right? Horse, fast doggy, right? Things along those lines. And as they get more sophisticated and get more information, they learn like, oh no, a doggy is a doggy. but a zebra is not a donkey, it's something else. And so they kind of start that simple and then they can elaborate based on the knowledge we gain, the experiences we have. So example here of depressive schema that people will experience when they are depressed and determine how they will react. And the example I'm going to use here is one that Dr. Levine used for us when we were in undergrad. And he had forgotten to bring a handout for us this day. So that gives you some context. Memories. Oh, that time I forgot to bring the handout. Generalizations. I make a mess of everything because you forgot the handout one time. Attitudes. I'm a failure. I'm worthless. And then premises or beliefs, right? And these are things we set up for ourselves that are unrealistic much of the time. I must be competent at everything. And Levine in particular was very open with us about the fact that he was type A. He had initially started his research studying type A behavior. And so he truly believed this. He was like, I've got to be competent at everything. I must never forget anything. When again, if we take a step back, we're like, everybody's going to forget something sometimes, right? It's just sort of human nature. We got a lot of information to keep track of. But we might have beliefs that if we don't do these things, we're a horrible person, we're a failure, we're worthless. And so you can imagine if that's the way you're thinking every day, that would just make you feel even more depressed, right? So these cognitive ideas, these schemas can keep us in these bad cycles or keep us in good cycles if they're positive. So what we've really worked our way up here is cognitive theory, and particularly cognitive theory as it applies to personality, psychopathology, therapy. So the main idea of cognitive therapy is that our thoughts, our cognitions, cause our negative emotions and the consequences we face. It's not the situation we're in, it's our thoughts about the situation. It's how we interpret the situation that leads us to feel one way or the other about it. And so the two main theorists for this are actually, unfortunately, now both have passed. Aaron Beck just died last year, but Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. And so Ellis developed what he called rational emotive theory and rational emotive therapy. You'll see the B is in parentheses. It became pretty trendy in the 70s into the 80s to also add behavioral things to cognitive theories. And Ellis was just like, it's always had behavioral stuff in it, so sure, call it REBT. And Beck, same thing. I think like to his death, Beck would have really called his therapy just cognitive therapy, but it certainly had behavioral components. And in general, that's how it's referred to as CBT instead of CT. All right, so we're going to start with Ellis. So Ellis was alive from 1913 to 2007. He studied with Karen Horney that we talked about earlier in the semester. He was psychoanalyzed by her because, again, remember, if you were going to be a psychoanalyst, you had to be psychoanalyzed, right? They eventually had a falling out, as many psychoanalysts with their trainees do, right? But Ellis really took inspiration from a lot of her work, and we'll see that as we look at what his theory is. Ellis also really admired Adler, who we talked about earlier in the semester. Ellis was really interested in the goals people make, and Adler talked a lot about these goals, and he referred to them as the fictions people create for themselves. So if you think back to the McAdams article we read at the beginning of the semester, these would be those third level traits. In therapy, Adler told stories. He made jokes with the client, and he gave homework assignments between sessions. His version of psychoanalysis was really problem focused. How can we get the patient beyond just, yes, but, right? Always sort of arguing, always sort of trying to rationalize with us. And Ellis really admired this direct problem solving application of therapy. And then Eysenck was one of the first great behavior therapists, and he did a lot of research on behavior therapy. In particular, he looked at psychoanalysis and he said, psychoanalysis is really ineffective. And he looked at research on psychoanalysis and he said, psychoanalysis doesn't work a lot of the times, and in fact, it can be harmful to people rather than helpful. And I realized I skipped Wolpe, so we gotta mention Wolpe. So Wolpe was another early behavior therapist, and he was the one who came up with systematic desensitization for the treatment of phobias. And so this is what we talked about last class, where we talk about, you don't just like throw the person in the room and make them pick up the snake, right? You work them up to it. That systematic desensitization. And although he was not a great admirer of Rogers, Ellis's therapy really is humanistic. He had a sort of the same philosophy behind it in terms of believing in the essential dignity of human beings. But if you asked Ellis himself, he'd never be like, yeah, I was inspired by Rogers. So he developed this rational emotive therapy. And as I mentioned, he later changed it to rational emotive behavioral therapy to like follow the trends. And he founded the Albert Ellis Institute. And he really was a clinician more than a scientist. He certainly published some scientific papers. He published a lot of popular press books. But he didn't really dedicate his life to research. He was more about teaching, doing therapy. He used to, at the Albert Ellis Institute, which is in New York City, have like, I think it was like Friday nights, Thursday or Friday nights, like open session, anyone could come and learn about therapy. And he would have like a simulated patient and role play therapy and talk about issues. Really sad thing at the end of his life that my ethics and professional issues professor told us about when we were in grad school is Ellis and the board of the Ellis Institute got into like a dispute at the end of his life, and they sort of took over the institute, and Ellis ended up like living in the basement of the institute. It was really kind of sad. And so this really great mind in psychology sort of like withered away, which yeah, again, a little bit heartbreaking. All right, so I have a brief video of Ellis talking about his therapy. Sharing sound.
People disturb themselves. They don't get disturbed. That's psychoanalytic nonsense. They disturb themselves largely.
So again, here you see this crux of this cognitive argument. People disturb themselves. It's not what happens to them that disturbs them. They disturb themselves with their own thoughts about what happens to them.
By what they tell themselves. And they first take adversities, hassles, problems of life seriously, which is good. But then they take it too seriously and lose their sense of humor. So we have many cognitive thinking techniques, many experiential, emotive feeling techniques, and many behavioral. But one of the ones that overlaps is humor, because it's a thinking technique. It interrupts your nutty thinking, and it's a feeling technique, and it's also behavioral. It pushes you on. So we give all our clients my famous group of rational, humorous songs that rip up anxiety.
So this is a big part of what Ellis did. I mean, he wasn't a good singer, but he would just make up these songs that help people to kind of remember things and have fun in therapy.
And depression and horror humorously. And they sing this to themselves when they're upset. And then they temporarily get upset, but then they have the leeway to think about what they did to upset themselves and to undo what they did to make themselves upset.
Could you give us one of these humorous songs?
Well, if you would let me know beforehand, I don't even remember my own songs, but I'll see if I can do one and remember it.
Okay, go for it.
Love me, only me, or I will die without you. Make your love a guarantee so I can never doubt you. Love me totally, really try, dear. For if you man love too, I'll hate you till I die, dear. And it goes on.
So you can kind of see his personality really was a positive aspect for his clients. And incorporating that humor really makes it more accessible to people as well. And it's something that I think a lot of modern therapists do. And certainly Ellis didn't come up with it. Remember, Freud used humor in his sessions as well. And I just think Ellis made it a more central part of how he communicated and connected with people. So REBT, the true and like why it's called rational emotive, is that the true belief here is that people can solve their problems by way of rational thought. So here we have antecedents. And now our beliefs is no longer, our B is no longer behavior. For Ellis, the B becomes beliefs. And Ellis said we should focus on the B, the beliefs. So this is a shift for how we're using the letter B in these models. The C is still your consequences, but he added a D, and the D was disputation. And the disputation is using rational thought, using logic, arguing with yourself to try to solve your problems. So the focus in the therapy is on these B beliefs and whether they're irrational thoughts or are you thinking rationally? And you want to make that distinction, and you really focus in on these irrational beliefs that people have. So the idea here is that there is a human tendency to transform what you'd like to have into what you must have or what you should have. And if you don't have it, you're a horrible person, right? You failed somehow. These are Adler's basic mistakes. These are Horney's neurotic needs. And so these ideas of musts and shoulds were borrowed very heavily from Horney's work. Again, even though the two of them had a falling out, he was very influenced by her work. I mean, he really kind of stole the idea of the tyranny of the shoulds from Horney. The idea is that these irrational beliefs become self-defeating, but also self-perpetuating. So if we think about the self-efficacy we talked about before, these are going to cut into that every time. You can't do this because you're a horrible person, because you don't have these abilities. These shoulds, oughts, musts, got tos, and can'ts are associated with negative feelings. So if we were going to use Rogerian terms, these are conditions of worth. I am not worthy of love because I'm not meeting these irrational expectations. And then irrational beliefs can add up to anxiety, guilt, anger. They're not constructive. So Ellis, again, using his humor, talked about these as awfulizing or masturbating. He would say things like, don't should on yourself. And then you would have undesirable consequences as the result of these irrational beliefs. So you would feel depressed, anxious, angry, worthless. So the goal within his therapy is to get to the rational beliefs. The rational beliefs are where you can distinguish what you'd like to have happen from what you can do to have it happen, and from what's realistic to expect to happen. Right? So irrational beliefs are going to tell you, this has to happen or I'm a horrible person. I'm worthless. Rational beliefs might be like, okay, so like maybe we can't get to that level of perfectionism, but maybe we can be a little better than we are. So these are preferences or wishes instead of like shoulds and musts. They are authentic, constructive emotions. Rational beliefs can give us positive motivation to work towards our goals, and can also be involved in self-nurturance. So one of the big things that is actually really popular to study now is self-compassion. And this kind of links to ideas about mindfulness that have really come into play with modern behavioral therapies. And self-nurturance and self-compassion really are like giving yourself grace, taking care of yourself, and they're a huge indication of how well you'll do in therapy, for example. Okay, so let's talk about the C, the consequences. So again, remember, these are the consequences of your beliefs. These are not the consequences of your behaviors. They're the consequences of how you're thinking about the given situation, about that antecedent situation. Oftentimes, your consequences are going to be powerful negative emotions. If you think, I have to be perfect all the time, and then you're not perfect because no one can be, right? Then you're going to feel awful. And you're going to think, well, of course, I'm not a worthy person because I'm not perfect. They can also lead to escape and avoidance behavior. Escape is where you just leave a situation when it's overwhelming for you. Avoidance is where you just don't engage with situations that might trigger sort of these negative emotions or your feelings of inadequacy, and also just feelings of ineffectiveness. And further negative self-evaluations that are going to further those irrational beliefs and lead to more negative consequences. So much of the therapy in rational emotive therapy is disputation, the D. So people learn to, well, first of all, people just learn that they have these irrational beliefs, right? This is not something that most people realize they're doing to themselves. But then they also learn to change them or challenge them. And how do we do that in therapy? Well, first we have cognitive methods, just challenging the thoughts. So a big part of rational emotive therapy and also cognitive therapy that we'll talk about on Monday is just using sort of rational logic. Like, is that actually the most logical way to think about this? Right? What's the worst that could happen? What's the best that can happen? What's the most likely thing to happen? What would you say to a friend who said what you're saying to yourself about themselves? Things along those lines. The emotive piece is helping people realize what the emotional consequences are to these irrational beliefs, and really trying to help them change their emotions by changing the beliefs. And then in terms of the behavioral, here we go back to Adler and his idea of acting as if. Go out and act as if you're not depressed. Go out and act as if it doesn't matter if you make a mistake, and see what happens. So really, you're challenging your sense of what you can and cannot do. You're challenging your sense of self-efficacy. Alrighty, we will stop there for today and we'll pick back up on Monday. Right, everybody have a good weekend.